This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. A low horn sounded, building steadily as Ramses looked out at the sea towards the oncoming ships. He knew what was coming towards them, having received word from kingdoms to the north of an impending visit from a force with no name. The ancient Minoans had been sacked, the Mycenaean Greeks depleted, and while the rest of the Aegean crumbled in turmoil, the great pharaoh of Egypt, Ramses, with a steady hand prepared to take on the peoples from the sea. His chariots waiting, archers taking aim, and his foot infantry readying themselves for blood. These strange warriors hit the shores of the ancient city of Tanis, near the mouth of the Nile, met with the first wall of Egyptian arrows. These men held round, leather-covered shields like none the Egyptians had seen before, and as some were pierced by arrows, others broke through the threshold between the sea and the Egyptian forces, seen from afar, cascading waves of bronze spears meeting with the oncoming horses. The next to come was blood. The sound of screams and clashing metal could be heard from the distant alleyways as Egyptian peasants scurried away into hiding, for the sea peoples had arrived. Thousands of years later, we still do not know the origins of these mysterious invaders. Who they were, where did they come from, and how could an unknown pirate confederacy topple the most powerful empires on Earth, sending the ancient world spiraling into the Dark Ages. Join us on Into the Portal for an investigation into one of ancient history's greatest mysteries and one of the most important events in all of human history, the incursion of the Sea Peoples.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay. And welcome back, everyone.
Yes, welcome. We've got a brand new episode for all of you lovely people today.
Indeed we do.
And I can't wait to dive into this one.
It's cool. You weren't super pumped on it at first, but then you kind of came around throughout the week. You were like really into it the other day. And you were like,
oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I was just like, basically talking your ear off about it. And you were like, hey, Amber, yeah, this is why we chose this.
Yeah, exactly.
I was already into it.
Pretty much. We have a new review on Facebook, though, before we get started. A couple housekeeping things.
Yeah, we wanted to thank all of our lovely people in our Facebook community. I think we missed a couple. We dropped the ball on some of these recommendations, but they were so lovely. And I want to say special thank you to Tim Hoop.
Yeah.
It's just such a pleasure that we can brighten your day up. We know how it feels working tedious jobs, and
definitely
anything we can do to help, it really just made my day.
Yeah.
And then as well, I can't remember if we dropped the ball on this one, but Drayton Lewis, he left a really awesome review.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the Spirit of the North episode, the Wendigo one, and how much he enjoyed it. So that's one of my personal favorites. I revisit that one. Yeah. And I feel like we need to maybe do a little bit of a follow-up, or I don't even know.
Maybe we should.
Something fun. Like if we find a particular narrative involved.
Totally. And we've already done shout-outs for our buddy Wes over there in Australia, but he left us a sweet review on Facebook too that I don't know if we ever read out, and we kind of backtracked and we're like, holy crap, did we forget to read that? So thank you for leaving that review.
Well, his one on Facebook was, it was awesome. All he said, he was like, oh, I love this show. It's like I'm part of the conversation, which I love. But then he also left us one on Podbean, and we did read this one out quite a while ago.
Right.
But it was really fun. He was talking about how he wanted to give us 5 out of 5 bunyips, but he didn't want our egos to get swollen. So thank you, Wes.
4.5 bunyips. Yeah, that's nice. That's perfect. Yeah. And
one more name drop.
Oh, one more name drop. Yeah, of course. Shout out to Chris Birkenbein, and you know why. I needn't say more. Actually, there is one more thing, Amber, that we didn't write in here. But I do want to just thank everyone, all of our listeners, because we hit a milestone this weekend.
Oh, we
hit 100,000 total downloads. We've surpassed that now, and we're just so pumped. It's a massive milestone for us. So thank you so much, everybody, for subscribing and downloading to us, passing the show along to friends and stuff like that. It is all because of you guys, and we love it so much.
It's so incredible, hey?
Yeah, we're pumped.
We were hoping to have that as like a Christmas present, like at the very end of the year, and it's come early, so we were just really pumped on it.
Definitely.
I can't believe it, honestly. We were joking, we're like, what if we made $1 off of every play? We'd be rich.
Yes, we would, indeed. Well, I mean, I guess, hey, perfect time to plug Patreon. Go check us out on Patreon, you guys, and helps kick a few bucks over to the show.
Of fun on Patreon this month. Like, we've had a lot of new contributors, which is so cool. Definitely. I really love it, and we're brainstorming away for our new Patreon episodes for December.
Totally.
We're gonna have a special gift for everyone, though, because December's the month of giving, right?
Absolutely.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. So kick us like $5 on there, and you get episodes.
Of the yin yang.
All right, we ready to jump into this?
Please, let's do it. All right, so we are getting into some crazy history, which we're going to make as entertaining as possible for you guys, because there's going to be a lot of different groups, a lot of names, and we're not going to get super bogged down in all of that. But yeah, so basically we are going to be talking about none other than the incursion of the mysterious sea peoples. And this occurred at the time of the Bronze Age collapse. So we're talking 1200 BCE. And yeah, basically the thesis of this episode, or the main idea, is that the devastation and the power vacuum the sea peoples brought about at the close of the Bronze Age basically resulted in one of the most tumultuous, important, influential periods of all human history. There was a lot of transitions, a lot of exactly that. Like, the power vacuum created a lot of openings for new developments, new prosperities, and new technologies, which was obviously the Iron Age after that. But essentially, this was a time of drastic transitions, brutal falls of imperial powers operating in the region for centuries. And it was also a time in which many hallmarks of civilization were lost for hundreds of years in like a sort of a mini dark age. So, we're getting into it. Yeah, it's really fun.
The craziest thing about this story and the history of the Sea Peoples is that hardly any, unless you've taken classes studying the ancient Near East, hardly anyone has ever heard of this before.
Right.
Like, we have been asking people all week, you know, in our family, friends and stuff like that, people have not heard of this. They're like, are you going to do an episode on mermaids? Is what people think, right? We're not doing an episode on mermaids, as much as I'm sure some of you are disappointed.
Oh, I was dreaming about that,
But
led by Poseidon himself.
Poseidon does have a sort of a semi-potential role in this, in a way. But anyway, so we're getting here into the end of the Bronze Age. And before the collapse, the Bronze Age was a very prosperous time. The empires of Egypt and the Hittites and the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, they were powerful people. And the Bronze Age was obviously known for bronze, and because it was used for weaponry. That's the main reason behind the name,
Tools, ornaments, a lot of religious artifacts were made with bronze during this time.
Yeah, so it was a time when tin was a major aspect of trade, because of course you combine tin and copper, you smelt them together in order to make bronze, and people discovered very, very quickly that one way of doing this is with arsenic, but that doesn't bode so well for the manufacturers coming out of it alive. So they needed to discover new ways of metalworking, and they did. And this led to massive trade routes all over the world, supplying copper and tin and these types of things.
So, like, one of the main advents of this time, obviously, like you said, is this ability to forge bronze, and that requires a lot higher temperatures. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think it was like 1200 degrees for... I don't know. I'm not even going to say, because that's going to be wrong.
Whatever. It doesn't matter. You can look it up, but anyone can look it up.
But it's really cool, right? Because this, like we said, like an era, it's almost like a mini industrial revolution. Like, we watched a ton of documentaries and saw so much information that basically points to that. And like, some of the sites where these smelting factories were situated to this day maintain highly toxic amounts of the residual heavy metals and other elements that would have been left behind.
Which is crazy.
Which is really cool. And like, the guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, he was an expert, and he was basically saying like, this is way more intensive than I ever imagined, just based on the trace amounts left. So a lot of powerful empires and a lot of commerce going on and a lot of interconnectivity. It's almost like a mini globalization period, right?
Yeah, within this that one section of Europe and extending into Asia Minor and stuff like that. Yeah, this was, an era of great wealth because of this, like you just said. And it's evident mostly because of the engineering marvels that we see at the time, right? So we have the enormous palace temple complex at Knossos on the island of Crete. We have the fortified royal settlements of the Mycenaean Greeks on the islands throughout the Aegean. The Hittite capital of Hattusa in northern Turkey was a massive, bustling city. The ports of Ugarit in Syria and Tyre in Lebanon and these types of places, they were massive populations, wealthy cities with kings that were extremely wealthy and adorned with the metals of the time, because gold was another one that was very widely worked with, obviously.
Right.
So this is a sort of a snapshot of the Bronze Age, like all the way from Egypt to the Black Sea, when, the world was, if you weren't in the main centers of the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Minoans and things like that, the rest of Europe was essentially a series of powerful tribes and kingdoms.
Right. So let's name those. Okay. So we do have the Mycenaean Greeks. So that's like in the Peloponnesian sort of peninsula area.
Yeah.
We do have the Hittite Empire. Hittitia? Is it Hittite or Hittite?
The Hittites.
The Hittite.
Yeah.
Such a weird name.
So that's modern day Turkey.
Exactly, yeah. So over there on that far eastern side. And then you get the Canaanites that are a little bit further. They're more in like where Syria is today, that type of thing, in the Sinai Peninsula. And then you have the all-powerful Egyptians. And they've got a massive empire in the south.
Right.
So that was really the main players. There were obviously islands, like we mentioned, Crete. There was also Macedonia in the south, or sorry, not the south, in the west.
Yep.
Let's not confuse everyone. This is going to be a challenge for me.
Okay, just go slow. Don't rush.
So just think about it as a big circle of all these powers, and they're all on the coastline of the Mediterranean and the Aegean seas.
Yes.
And so it's this nice little pocket of civilization that's about to be disrupted by a bunch of pirates and crazy people.
Essentially.
Yeah.
The picture we're painting is that it's all kind of hunky-dory, powerful empires. There's a lot more detail behind it. And we're going to get into some of the reasons why a pirate confederacy was able to topple these empires.
Exactly.
Maybe they weren't as strong as we think they were.
True.
But at this point, tail end of the Bronze Age, we're coming up towards the year of around 1200 BCE, and things take a drastic turn for these empires controlling the region.
Totally. Yeah, so we get what is known as the Bronze Age collapse.
A very fitting description, yeah.
I feel like Todd Campbell right now, our history professor.
The Mycenaeans decided to attack him. No, we're not doing that today.
Okay, so as we alluded to, this was an era of massive interconnected trade, diplomacy, competing empires and imperial ambitions. Obviously, this would lead to a lot of conflicts, issues, and some people believe that it's almost like it's very similar to analogies that we make for globalization today, where it's like we're going to get to this point where we're going to be overextended, and it's going to just basically collapse from within. So some people do believe that this was the case for the Bronze Age collapse as well. There are many reasons, though, for why a collapse would have happened around this period. There was sort of I don't want to say, like, basically kind of like a staling of the economy. There was it was almost like a stagnation, a little bit of a recession almost. And
you could call it
did result in a little bit of desperation on the parts of powers and tribes that weren't as solidified and weren't as, Well,
especially ones on islands and things like that. Exactly. Island nations that were, they relied on sea trade only.
Totally. So that made you very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that's kind of one of the main reasons why people think that the sea peoples could have been so successful as well. So this began at about 1200. So 1278 BCE, as the records go, to about 1176. And this was a spread out period of attacks. Like, we say about 50 years is actually more like 100 years, but they weren't like it wasn't like wing bang boom, like they're just like constant attack, like World War II all the time.
Waves.
Exactly, waves. That's important. So basically, the story surrounding the Sea Peoples begins with this epic collapse of like the Greeks, the Egyptians were starting to get a little overextended, perhaps, the Hittites, Minoans, and Canaanites. So what truly makes this mystery of the Sea People so fascinating is that new evidence keeps surfacing. And there is so many varied descriptions of almost like you said, waves of pirates and waves of these different factions. And they were constantly shifting. And it made their true identity very muddied.
Yes.
And it made the leadership of this sort of pirate confederacy a mystery. No one knew who was commanding these people and why they were there and where they came from. Right. So those are the main reasons: who, what, and where.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we still don't know. This is widely debated. There are so many different theories among scholars today.
Yeah.
All we know is that these people were fierce. They were warriors, and they were intensely organized.
Yeah.
They were professional.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. They were definitely professional armies or made up of professional mercenaries along with other groups and stuff like that. Yeah, it's absolutely bizarre. And just to reiterate again, just to really hammer this home, the reason this is so insane is that these are waves of attacks on, I just want to really hit this home, the biggest empires in the world. Mm-hmm. Like known empires in the world, especially in that region of the world, right? Yeah. So this is a random band of pirates, of seafaring tribes combining together and overcoming the largest armies in the world. In the most simplest ways, because the tactics that we'll get into that they used were just that. They didn't comply with the more elite style of offensives that were mostly used by these empires at the time. So it was kind of a revolutionary way of engaging in almost like not guerrilla warfare, but different style warfare. Yeah, definitely a different style of warfare. And, you know, that I guess that's maybe one of the things, we'll get to that in the theories section, like the inability to change your tactics was maybe a reason why some of these empires fell. Mm-hmm. But when you're just thinking of the sheer size of them is what's so surprising, right? A band of pirates coming from the sea cannot possibly be the same size of the military forces of these massive empires. It's like a 300 type situation here, except on the reverse side. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we've got, like you said, the Canaanites sort of slowly disappear. The Minoans, who are the earliest European civilization to have writing and advanced technology, and also are known as possibly being the Atlanteans, they are wiped out. Mm-hmm. The Egyptians are the only ones who managed to kind of limp their way through this, at least the first set of waves of incursions. Mm-hmm. And they're receiving letters and letters from other kings and other tribal groups further to the north, hearing about these people coming towards them, which is kind of crazy. But it's essentially the Egyptians become weakened to the point of near destruction as well, but they do survive. It's interesting too, because the Egyptians suffered these waves of attacks under two different emperors, right? And I think that's fascinating, right? That just, again, adds to this sense of longevity of and persistence too. Yeah. Makes you think that these people really had nothing to go back to. Yeah. If they're just there, plundering, pillaging. Some of them seem to be settling. There was evidence of, say, women and children at some points. Yeah. But mostly these very austere mercenary type warriors. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because like you said, right, Egyptians started to get little tidbits down the way of these attacks happening in different locations across the Mediterranean. Yeah. So that kind of helps figure out, because this is a historical mystery, where they came from. They don't know if the attacks actually started from the northeast and kind of flooded in and went west, or if they started in sort of the west and just kind of spread like a wave over top. Right. The way we saw it laid out in one documentary that does make a lot of sense if you do want to sort of center the idea on that the Egyptians were last to be attacked. Right. So essentially they said that the Mycenaeans would have been first. The attack would have come from the west. It would have swept through and knocked out the Greek, that peninsula, the what's it called?
The Peloponnesian Peninsula. Boom.
Okay.
Good to know your Herodot once in a while.
There you go, that's right.
Or am I thinking Herodotus? Yeah, I am thinking Herodotus. Anyways, yeah, so the Mycenaeans would have been first, Minoans, because they're right in that area too. And then it would have swept eastward towards the Hittite Empire, wiped them out, down south, so around the bowl of the Mediterranean Sea. Got the Canaanites. There was one clue that was actually left that does support this particular hypothesis of direction of attack. And that was a tablet discovered in Ugarit.
Right.
Yes.
Very
so
cool.
this is interesting. Ugarit is a part of nowadays Syria. So it's in between the Hittite and Egyptian empires. And it lies about 6 miles north of the Syrian port of Latakia on the Mediterranean coast.
Okay.
So there are ruins that evidence that this was an actual city. It wasn't uncovered until quite recently, I believe, in the last couple hundred years kind of thing. But it lies about half a mile from the shore. It's interesting. It was a very strategic spot for trade. But essentially there was this tablet, and it was uncovered, and it detailed the destruction to come of these sea peoples. And it was interpreted by many like scholars and researchers that had uncovered it as a warning message to be sent further south towards Egypt.
Right. Okay.
Was the idea. So that again supports the sort of west to east to south sweep of attack.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, and we are going to have maps. I'm definitely going to include that in the resources section, just to websites that are most helpful for us, and then also in the blog once we release it too, just so people can get it. The original story goes that the tablet with this warning message was actually discovered still sitting in the kiln where it was going to be fired, but I don't know, like I guess it hadn't been, and it was just waiting there, never made it out. So as everyone knows, none of this was sent forward, therefore there wasn't a lot for the Egyptians to kind of that's ominous, right? Like you find there's a message waiting to be fired, and what's the reason it never made it out? Because the attack was so
swift.
Exactly.
There has been some research after the fact saying that it's possible that it was actually just appeared to be in a kiln, that it was underneath a basket that had deteriorated over top of the tablets, and it looked as if it was in some sort of an ancient kiln, but it's possible that it just fell out of a basket and it had been fired. But either way, it never made it to where it was supposed to go, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting, too, because actually this tablet was one of many things found. And there were letters of this period preserved at the same city of Ugarit. And it does reveal, quote unquote, a city suffering from raids by pirates.
Interesting.
And one of these groups, which is named, is called the Shakala, can be connected to the Sea Peoples because the same name and the same tribe appears in contemporary Egyptian inscriptions of these looting vandals, these mercenary type pirates.
Just that description, right? Doesn't that just sound very Viking-esque, or very like pirates, but pirates from the era we know of pirates, like in the 16 and 1700s, right?
Swashbuckling.
Yeah, where they're raiding villages and they're just coming in and, killing women and children and taking what they want.
The Anne Bonnies and Mary Reads of the world.
Very much so. Absolutely.
But again, right, yeah, so the tablet never made it, message was never sent, and the inscription was vague, right? But you do get that one inkling that connects it back to the Sea People inscriptions of the Egyptian record. Yeah. Which is basically the sole record that we rely on for the Sea Peoples.
That's just it. It's basically the only records are coming out of the ancient Egyptian tombs, and pretty much documented exclusively by Ramses II and Ramses III. They were the only empire to truly survive these attacks, although you could argue that, and many historians do, that they didn't really survive, because, shortly after this we see, well, not shortly after, shortly after in the massive window that is human history, but a few hundred years go by, and then sure enough, the Persians and Greeks are really in control of the region, and the Egyptians fall off from their pedestal, basically, right?
And that's where we get the story of Cambyses.
That's right.
Taking over Egypt.
Eventually, Eventually, absolutely.
That's a lot later, though. That's like almost 1,000 years later.
Which is insane to think, right?
That is insane.
Like, that's 1,000 years later from what we're talking about, and that was over 2,500 years ago from where we're sitting today.
Can we just talk about what the other day, when we were trying to fathom this, because, like, all you people listening back at home, if you're anything like me, it's really hard to put into context, like, even, like, you know, like, okay, from sitting here at this point in the present day to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1800, that seems like a buttload of time to me. And that's not. No. That's like a blink of the eye.
A couple hundred years.
But it's funny, right? Because as you get further down the line towards classic history and, like, that high golden age of the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age and all this stuff, I see it, it's almost like an accordion where that end is really scrunched together and it seems really close, and then everything that sort of becomes more and more present and more modern is stretched out for me. Yeah. And I know that a lot of people are probably feeling like, if you're, yeah, like I said, if you're anything like me, it is just hard to fathom.
Totally.
But just take a minute and just...
Well, that's why we're so fascinated in all of this stuff, right?
Well, exactly, yeah.
The abilities of people such a long time ago, and just, like, the idea of what could have happened.
Mm-hmm.
How could these pirates have banded together? Because we really don't know... We don't really know the order of attacks.
No.
You gave a rough idea...
of what could have...
And we do know that the Egyptians weren't first.
Right.
They couldn't have been first.
But they were conveniently in the south. They were far away from a lot of other populations. Like, sure, maybe from Africa there could have been... Like, I just don't think there would have been any kingdom strong enough to actually take on the Egyptians. But even if it was from the west or the east, right? Like, the Egyptians wouldn't have been first. So
no, right. But what we do get from the Egyptians, though, is they identified 9 factions of sea peoples that came in successive waves, but they were all working together in some sort of a coalition coming from beyond the seas. Where they were from, we do not know. The only thing that the Egyptians stated was that they came from the north. Right. Seas from the north. The problem with that is every single empire we've stated, other than the Canaanites, who are sort of lateral to the Egyptians, are north of Egypt.
Yeah.
So everyone is northern. You know, some people take that as being like, it's the Norse. It's the Vikings coming from the north. It's like, well, no, it could have been the Mycenaean Greeks. It could have been tribal factions from all kinds of northern.
Could have been from perhaps maybe the cumulus tribes up in mainland Europe. Even though that's a stretch.
Could have been. Some scholars do point to southeastern Turkey as the origin of the first wave of sea peoples, but others argue that western central Mediterranean is more likely. So Sicily, Sardinia, some of these islands where tribal kingdoms would have existed. And in times of scarcity, tribal kings are the ones who are going to rise up, band together. The question is, how was that able to overcome these empires?
That's interesting, actually, because... if you think about it, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. These islander, like, smaller kingdoms, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves right now, but the idea that they would have been familiar with the classical warfare tactics imposed by these empires, and they would have had ways to combat that by using none other than runners, which are the badasses of the ancient war realm, and I love these guys. This is one of my favorite theories, but I'm not actually going to get into the theory part of it right yet.
Okay.
But essentially what we wanted to talk about here was the fighting styles and the style of warfare at this time. And a lot of this was done, there was 2 classes. There was an elite class of warrior, and then there was the foot soldier. So the elites were always in chariots. They were driven by horses. They were elevated above the masses, and would basically just kind of charge in and do their thing. And the runners, the ground soldiers, the foot guys, would have to go and clean up the mess and actually
finish people off.
Finish them off. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So obviously, yeah, we get this social stratification within the military. There's a higher class, and then I think this could have resulted in some sort of, I don't even know, like maybe perhaps a little bit of a revolution. But anyways, I'm not going to get into that right now.
Okay.
But essentially, yeah, like we get into, the sea peoples were armored in much the same way as these mercenary foot soldiers that were employed by empires like the Egyptians, like the Hittites, like all of these sort of Mediterranean powers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I'm not going to get into it right now because we're on theories. I feel like we should just get into theories.
Well, that's okay. Well, here, let me make this point too while you're on the topic of like their weapons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's important to mention that in these first waves that the Egyptians describe is that they had round shields with leather covering them, which was not the same as the Egyptians. They used short javelin-like spears, which were
sphincters. I mean,
short javelin sphincters.
Scimitars, which is like that, like Arab-looking sword.
Totally.
Thing.
And these were also not used by the Egyptians or people they were familiar with.
Huh.
And there's also descriptions of horned helmets.
And long beards.
And we do know that some other Aegean groups had horned helmets, but also we know that that sounds distinctly northern.
Kind of does.
Anyway, continue.
Well, that was just my one main point there, because we did want to cover that, right? The fact that these sea peoples were on foot made them so much more effective. They were just wiping out these chariots. As soon as you injure a horse, the chariot's wrecked, right? Like, you can't really recover from that. You don't have an extra spare horse, not like a spare tire.
No.
But, so essentially they were very effective. They were brutal. And like we said, right, they were obviously trained. They were effective together.
That is the most curious part. They were trained.
Trained by who?
By who, when, where, and how were they able to coordinate? That's the thing. What is the nucleus of this confederation? Because there has to be someone who's kicked this all off. Because it is coming in successive waves. They are working together, and they're not settling the places they destroy. They destroy stuff, they create a power vacuum, and then they leave, and they come back again later.
Yeah. Again, that sounds very Viking-esque, right?
It?
Because it's, exactly that. It would have been pillaging, looting, and then continuing on.
Yeah. And just...
Not to say that we are saying that it is the Norse.
No, we're not saying that.
No.
We'll talk about that in the theory section. But just, again, and the short spears is really unique. Because those were exclusively known for hunting. They weren't used in any armies of any of these empires.
Oh, that's very true, yeah.
Those were only used for hunting, peasant class, basic defense. They were not weaponry used in these massive armies.
No.
Whose idea was that? Did that just happen out of necessity?
Was it fluke because they just realized how effective it was, especially if you are up against horses and stuff like that? And you just jam them up and...
But because they had the chariots, and they had their archers in the chariots, and archers are only effective from a distance, right? You're not going to have archers... They're useless on short range.
Yeah.
So... Yeah, they discovered really quickly that these sea peoples were...
Don't tell that to Legolas over there.
Well, okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah. So, we know about these waves, like I said, because of the Egyptians, but most exclusively because of excavations of two temples, that of Ramses II and Ramses III. So, the final resting place of Ramses III is known as the Medinet Habu. And... I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me touch on Ramses II first.
Okay.
Ramses II was known as Ramses the Great, which is such a great name. It's just like Cyrus the Great, the father of Cambyses and all this kind of stuff.
Frederick the Great.
Frederick the Great, Alexander the Great. And he actually was, though, Ramses. He was legit. One of the most effective rulers in the history of ancient Egypt, and we know this because of the accomplishments that he documented. He secured the borders against invasions by other nomadic tribes, and he did have some success against the Sea People. Basically, in his account, the Sea Peoples are mentioned as, this is interesting, allies of the Hittites.
Ooh.
Now... I don't think he exclusively says the Sea Peoples, but potentially it was referring to the Shekelesh, or one of the tribal factions linked to the Sea Peoples that apparently are linked to the Hittites and serving as mercenaries for them, which is fascinating.
That is interesting. That's a juicy accusation.
Pretty much.
So they're blaming the Hittites for all of this.
Yeah.
That's cool. Because one of the main theories we were going to get into is that perhaps... these peoples came from adjacent kingdoms that were not controlled by the Hittites, but were on the same sort of peninsula.
Right, exactly. So all of this comes from the inscription on the Merintaf. So it's the burial temple of Ramses II. It basically says that the Libyans attempted to invade the Nile Delta. It writes how in the 5th year of his reign, in 1209 BC, there's a chief of the Libyans that was allied with the Sea Peoples. So there's another juicy tidbit there. He refers to the Libyan allies as coming, quote, from the seas to the north, which we just said before could be a lot of different places.
Yeah.
The names of these territories, as he names them as the Ekoesh, the Teresh, the Luka, the Sheridan, and, like I just said, the Shekelesh tribes. Scholars have since sort of tried to identify these, but we do not know exactly where they're from.
Yeah. And a lot of people will try and do, like, equate parallels with, like, say, the Shekelesh were the Sardinians. And, like, there might be some evidence to support that, but a lot of it is very loose.
It's also just relying on our, like, modern interpretation of, like, the phonetics. You know what I mean? Like, basically saying this is similar to that, so they must have been referring to the Sardinians because it sounds similar.
Exactly.
That's sort of, it can get to be a little sticky there.
Well, exactly. And a little bit too convenient, perhaps, too.
Yeah.
You know?
Even more interesting, though, than the documentations from Ramses II, it comes from his successor, Ramses III. Yeah. And there's a crazy scene on the side of the Medinet Habu depicting prisoners of the Philistines, and we'll talk about that a little later in the episode. Mm-hmm. But this is so cool. It's basically a series of hieroglyphics describing his achievements against the Sea Peoples, and also their achievements against Egypt, like what they were capable of doing. Okay. This is one of the quotes from the Medinet Habu. It basically it translates as, I established my boundary in Dahi, prepared in front of them the local princes, garrison commanders, and Marainu. I caused to be prepared the river mouth like a strong wall with warships, galleys, and skiffs. They were completely equipped with both fore and aft with brave fighters carrying their weapons and infantry of all the pick of Egypt, being like roaring lions upon the mountains. The chariotry were able warriors and all goodly officers whose hands were competent. Their horses quivered in their limbs, prepared to crush the foreign countries under their hooves. So it's all very dramatic, right?
Very cool. So he prepared. That's really cool. So he had the warships ready to go.
Yeah.
He was the only one that met them at sea.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm. Right? And that was the big linchpin of their success.
Yeah.
A lot of people believe, because they were able to use fire and archery and basically just firebomb the ships.
Let's just point out the massive irony of that. The Sea Peoples are not good at fighting on the water.
They're not true pirates.
They come from the sea, but they are land fighters. They're grit and grind. They're like the Memphis Grizzlies of the Bronze Age. They're just like spears and work.
It's a true testament to how important the seas were for travel at that time. Yeah. And it wasn't just the seas; there were the rivers as well, and that could have connected all of mainland Europe, even up to like the UK, which it actually did. And there's definitely proof of that, and we're going to get into the whole Bronze Age trade routes and how that could possibly be connected back to the Sea Peoples. But yeah, like you said, he was one of the few successes. Ramses III. Boom, he's a boss, man.
He was legit. And the coolest name, too, of like most Egyptian pharaohs, I'll just say, in my opinion.
But it's interesting though, because even it wasn't infallible. Like, he had some great ideas, and he did meet them on the sea, which is great. But they just came back. They would come back again and again and again. And it's kind of annoying. It's like he defeats them. It's kind of annoying.
He wrote, the Sea Peoples were getting pretty annoying.
They were. It's like, come on, man. You defeat them in 1207, and they come back in 1180, and you're just like, God.
Well, that's the thing that I find bizarre too, because it's like, okay, because they had success the first two times in battles against Ramses II. Was like, if you're running away from a place that's desolate, famine, drought, things like that, or bad trade, why wouldn't you stay? Like, I don't know, like, what are you gaining by just taking some food, and then you kill some people, and then you're back to the same place? Like, where are you going back to? Because
speak to a few different things. Maybe they don't have the political organizations that they have with their military, right? So they don't have a way of actually governing over these places. And then you could also be of the mind that if these are like a 300, like where they're a minority, do you really want to get yourself settled in a place where potentially there are bigger, more powerful political factions that can just come and overthrow you?
Right, where you...
Like, is it just better to keep them weak? Keep them down and just keep knocking them down?
It's actually, that kind of makes sense, right? It's like, if they're successful because they are loose groups of mercenaries and things like that, then, yeah, you're going to have a real hard time all of a sudden being like, okay, we're here, let's have a centralized government.
Yeah,
and somebody to control taxes and food, and that...
It's like, no, screw that. That's probably more burden than they would want. Right. They're just there for probably very specific reasons, for supplies, for food, and for weapons, probably. And that's about that. I don't know. And to instill terror.
That's just it, though. It's like, you wonder if they were given some sort of like a Garden of Eden type message or something. Not that they're searching for an end.
Or like a Manifest Destiny type
something
thing.
Like that, where it's like, you're struggling, so go, take these empires and make your way, and eventually it will... I don't even know. You know what I mean? Like, who...
Like the Exodus, like some sort of...
The organization behind it implies that there's a greater purpose than just you're running away because you're hungry.
maybe they were searching for the Holy Grail. I'm kidding.
Not quite there yet.
Literally.
Like 1,200 years away. Actually, more than that. Like, yeah.
Yeah, a lot further down the way. Which, again, speaks to the accordion-like scenario that is my visual in my head of this history. But anyways.
Yeah. You've got an interesting quote here about some of the damage that they did.
Yes, I will read this out because this was from Ramses III, and it's quite interesting. So he says here, quote, "The Sea Peoples attacked and destroyed the Egyptian trading center at Kadesh, and then again attempted an invasion of Egypt. They began their activities with quick raids along the coast, as they had done in the time of Ramses II, before driving for the Delta. Oh, sorry. Ramses III defeated them in 1180 BCE, but they returned in force. Yeah. In his own victory inscription, Ramses III describes the invasion."
And actually, that was the quote that I just read previously.
Oh, okay, cool.
So
when he's talking about establishing his boundaries, how he has the river mouth strong wall with warships,
so he basically,
galleys.
He was prepped. He was the one that was prepped and ready to go.
Yeah, well, if you've inherited this struggle from your predecessor, then you better have some good ideas.
Yeah, your people are going to be pretty chapped if you don't.
And like we said, right, there were evidence of other things going on, like perhaps drought, famine,
earthquakes,
all this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of instability happening,
Absolutely.
Not just as a result of the Sea Peoples.
No, they could have just been the cherry on top.
Political reasons too. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, a cherry on top of just the perfect storm, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Almost like it was meant to be. The Bronze Age come into an end. You know what I mean? Mm. But, like I said, could this timing have been absolutely perfect? Was it just that these, it couldn't have just been that the Sea Peoples were just the greatest warriors ever and just had figured out how to defeat these massive armies.
No, they had things aiding them.
They got lucky. Mm-hmm. They got lucky, they got there at the right time.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that their timing could have been perfect is because of the Battle of Kadesh that took place in 1274 BCE, and that was led on the Egyptian side by Ramses II. And this was a massive battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites, who were definitely like major enemies. Like they were even more so enemies than like the Israelites and the Philistines almost.
And they're neighboring, right? Yeah. So that again, your borders encroaching on my borders, your resources are encroaching on my resources. Exactly. I don't like you very much.
So you got to wonder if maybe the news of how this battle ended up leaked out to factions that would have initiated the Sea People's incursions? Possibly, because in 1274 BC, the Hittites, led by King Muwatalli, who ruled from 1295 to 1272, invaded the city of Kadesh and took on the Egyptians, led by Ramses II. So they faced each other. I don't know exactly how long this battle lasted for, but both sides were extremely decimated. And just to give you a geographical location, if you look on the map, this is basically, Kadesh is located on the Orontes River on the border of modern Syria and Lebanon.
Okay.
So within that area there. Mm-hmm. What's really interesting about this battle, though, is that it was the first recorded history that actually depicted chariots as a major part of warfare, even though we knew that they had been in the past. This is where they really jazzed it up and were like, look at our chariots, they're awesome. No, really, because
chariots.
Because the inscriptions of them on the walls of things found, it's like there's massive, it's like a 50-foot tall like chariot thing, but they actually weren't very effective.
No.
Shortly after all the Sea People stuff, chariots would end up only really being used for reconnaissance and flanking and things like that.
Well, that's just reconnaissance I could see for sure, because like it's so awkward, right? It's almost just designed to protect the inhabitant. And just to kind of like, it's almost like someone with like a beater that's just going to go into like a monster truck rally or something. Yeah. Be like, boom, I'm just going to, but I'm protected because I've got the cage around me. Right. But I don't know. Chariots, man. Yeah, and then once you break an axle, then you're done.
Oh, you're toast.
What do you do?
You
have to abandon it.
You do.
In the middle of the battlefield? Like, what?
Time out, guys. Time out, guys. Yeah. What's even more curious about this battle, though, is we don't know who won. Both sides claim victory. Both sides were decimated from it. There has been a recently discovered tablets in Turkey that were documenting spoils of war coming from on the Hittite side, that they were receiving spoils of war from the Egyptians, indicating that they were the ones who probably tipped in favor of the Hittites in that battle.
Okay.
But of course, Egyptians, Ramses claimed it. He claimed that he cast them into the river like crocodiles and he slew whomever he desired, while the Hittite version reads, at the time of the king Mulatali made war against the king of Egypt when he defeated the king of Egypt. So not very descriptive on the Hittite side, but that's what they said. So, yeah. And of course, this would have left both sides weakened, ready for the already warmed up sea peoples who had been traveling around, potentially gathering more mercenaries as they went, battling Mycenaean Greeks and things like that.
Okay.
Ready to come down and take on the largest of them all, really, which was Egypt.
Yeah, that's very true. So just to reiterate, this battle, the Battle of Kadesh, ultimately resulted, or Kadesh, it resulted in what is known as the Great Peace, which lasted over 50 years. It was a pact signed by the Hittites and the Egyptians. Yeah. And it basically put a lot of mercenaries out of work.
Right.
Which some people think that could have been a major reason for the incursions of these sea peoples. Maybe they were the mercenaries. We don't know. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so maybe they were. But essentially, what we have here is that, just to reiterate again, seafaring pirate confederacy takes advantage of possibly weakened Hittites and Egyptians, already weakened by trade and e-commerce Mycenaeans and Minoans, and slaughters these people and creates a power vacuum.
Yeah.
Because they don't settle. That is the key thing.
Creates a power vacuum and creates a massive disruption in the coastal habits of a lot of these populations. And some of the best evidence we have of this type of destruction and this almost like massive migrations away from the coastlines is on the island of Crete, and it's called Mount Carfi. There was a Polish archaeologist in the 1980s. His name was Krzysztof Nowicki, and he actually mapped and reconstructed an extremely high up mountain fortress, essentially. Yeah. It was approximately 1,100 meters above sea level and was definitively not of the patterns previously seen, where it was easy, right? Of course you would be around the coast. You have water, you have food, you have trade resources, you have travel, all this kind of stuff. It doesn't make any sense why anyone would want to be at the top of this really desolate, really hard terrain to negotiate, especially if you have pack animals, anything like that, or cargo, whatever.
Definitely.
So the only reason you'd be up there is if you're hiding from something, if you're trying to secure yourself. And so basically, yeah, he uncovered these it wasn't massive, but it was significant settlements of large communities, right?
Definitely.
So essentially, yeah, there were huge blocks of stone that suggest permanent settlement, not a temporary one as suggested by previous scholars. But essentially, yeah, it is really an extremely difficult place to get to. There's almost like an invisible trail along the side of one of the jagged mountain faces. It's just like a sheer cliff of rock. And essentially you can take your pack animals up there one at a time, and it's very...
It's precarious.
You can't even see it from the bottom, right? It's meant to be invisible. It's meant to protect, is the idea.
Yeah.
And it's not the most loveliest place to live in. In the winter, it could be a little bit cold, a little bit windy.
Really windy.
Don't tell that to the Inuit, though. Because I feel like they would get insulted.
Well, from the Mediterranean, though, this was a place where people wouldn't have been living.
Very true,
Would not have been living.
Exactly.
The only reason for you to be there is to be running away from something. And that is exactly what we see at the end. At the end of the Bronze Age, the Egyptian records end, we know that the Sea Peoples were there, we get into the Dark Ages. People stop writing stuff down, people forget how to do things, and they flee. We see mass migration.
So this is kind of the evidence of one particular case on the island of Crete. So essentially, excavation of this site revealed around 20 to 30 buildings. It could have housed approximately 600 to 1,200 people. They said approximately 300 families, so that's multiple members.
Yeah, decent size.
It does date to the correct time. So this is right around 1200 BC. So right when the Aegean apocalypse was happening and all of these sea people's incursions were happening as well.
Definitely.
And so the main question, obviously, is what what is the meaning of this? Why did these people do this? Like, was it for protection? Was it like some sort of like mountain temple? But no, it wasn't that.
No.
And then other people say like, oh, it wasn't the sea peoples. It was drought and earthquake that made them go up there. Okay, first of all, I feel like the farther you get up on Crete, like we saw from the documentary footage, you're not getting fresh water sources from there. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And then earthquakes, why are you going higher?
You're going to a much more precarious location.
Exactly.
Running from earthquakes.
So it doesn't really make sense. The only thing that really makes sense is that there were these incursions of raiders that had made people have to pick up and leave, which is very sad.
That their empires weren't able to protect them from.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
The thing that Krzysztof Nowitzki makes a point of too is that this small village, the small town or whatever, would have been it survived because it would have had a very small class of warriors of its own. So like it would have been the Mycenaeans, Mycenaean warriors, and they very much like 300 like channeled it so that it was almost impossible to get to, except for going like one by one. The entire backside of the settlement was completely exposed. So the entire backside of it facing the inland, they were not afraid of anybody coming from there. Okay. And there were others. There were other tribes. There were people on the island. They were not afraid. They were worried about what was coming from the sea.
Right. The sea people.
Yeah.
And I would be too.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's very interesting. So yeah, it definitely shows that it was a human threat, not nature, that these people were running from.
Yeah. And he found more evidence of this too. So the same archaeologist, Krzysztof Nowitzki, found evidence on Mount Kalamata, so settlements as well as pottery, and they all dated to the same period and located in the same types of precarious locations that nobody would go to unless you're running away from something. This was then reconfirmed in the 1990s, by an American archaeologist named Donald Haggis, who accompanied Nowitzki to the first site on Crete in order to get a better idea of this and give his opinions on this high mountain pass village, basically. He described it as basically like you had to scale a cliff face using footholes carved into the rock, man-made footholes. So specifically hidden away. The crops and the areas for livestock were located kilometers below. So you had to sneak down to your crops and livestock, and you were more willing for them to be slaughtered or taken or stolen. Keep them far away from you. There's a reason behind that. Well, that's
the only way it would have been, like, because there was just like a basic, just like bare rock.
Yeah.
It was like bedstone, like, or bedrock.
Bedstone.
The stone of the bed.
The bed.
Okay. I don't know.
Yeah. And of course, what it had was great visibility, right? So it has a vantage point. You can see who's attacking you. That's another main part of this.
So they would have had hours to prepare if they did see something coming along.
Yeah. All in all, over 80 sites across the island of Crete alone where Nowitzki discovered were places of refuge and dating to the Bronze Age collapse. People hiding from the coast.
Interesting.
Hiding from the sea peoples. Absolutely bizarre.
I love that. And that's, like we said, that's the best evidence we have of the fleeing and of the attempts to evade these possible pirates.
Yeah. Before we get into theories, though, we're going to take a quick promo break for a really cool podcast that we've just started to get into. It is called Relic Podcast. And host Maxwell takes us on a journey digging under the couch cushions of history, looking for treasures and relics that have been misplaced by time. So very much interested in the same sort of things we are. So take a listen to this promo and check out Relic Podcast.
Who stole some of history's most famous paintings from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? Where is the Lost Dutchman's mine? And how come so many people who go looking for it never seem to come back? Relic, the Lost Treasure podcast's second season, investigates the mysteries behind unsolved artifact crimes and goes in search of lost treasures with very sinister reputations. You can catch all of Season 1 now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most streaming platforms. New episodes release every other Wednesday of the month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can also follow me, Maxwell, on Twitter at Lost Treasure Pod. The adventure continues.
And we're back. So make sure you guys go check out Relic Podcast.
Yeah.
So now we're getting into some theories. And there's a few points that I wanted to make just to keep in mind that we've mentioned so far. The ideas of drought, famine, obviously wars, like the Battle of Kadesh, weather, that being earthquakes, volcanic activity, and things like that. And then obviously the paranormal, if you want to chuck that in there in the end.
That was in the notes.
Didn't add it in there, but we're a paranormal show, so... I said Poseidon was going to come in here at some point. Maybe there was the god of the seas that rose up and led the sea peoples to an incursion on the Egyptians.
I believe it already.
Sorry, that's my idea. But yeah, no, definitely lack of food and water is a possibility leading to mass migrations of people and, banding together of mercenaries and things like that. And during this we do know that Ramses II wrote that there were women and children that were part of the caravans linked to these sea peoples. So that indicates fleeing populations, not just mercenaries and warriors.
You know, the thing that I kind of had in my head when I heard that was like, okay, so you see these people, you see women, you see children, and you see these warriors. Do you see them all together? Or perhaps there are families that are fleeing lands that have been previously desolated and demolished by these people, and so they're kind of just caught in the middle of all this stuff happening, and they're not actually a part of it, but they're just trying to make their way.
Right, like they're not traveling with them.
Exactly, they're just kind of there too, because they're like, okay, I'm traveling away from destruction, so are these people, I seem to be following them. I don't know.
Right.
But I do like the idea too that there were actual families involved,
because
and
the wealth and sustainability that was left in the region was definitely to be found in the the Nile Valley and the Levant. These were the fertile areas of the Mediterranean, and so that could possibly account for one of the reasons. But my question still is, how is it that they formed together? Like, what is the central power of all of this? To come back to the drought and things like that, though, there is archaeological evidence of drought taken from pollen samples and other plant archaeology in the late Bronze Age. So we know that there was massive drought, of course, leading to massive famine, because you can't grow anything. You can't water your animals. We know that as a thing. Yeah. How much of that played a part, though, is to, again, we don't know.
Yeah, that's And earthquakes, again, would have been a big factor, too. Could have displaced a lot of people. There is evidence in lots of these main cities, these strongholds, of, like in the ruins today, of exactly that, like whole walls that have been sort of like shooken apart, which only happens with tectonic activity. So it's almost like a snake.
Way, right?
Oh, true, yeah. So if you have like a whole bunch of columns, example, if they all fall the same direction, that can definitely point to some sort of seismic activity as well. And then there is the idea, the fact that there are two fault lines in this zone that match up with a lot of the city locations that declined during the end of the Bronze Age and collapsed. And so, scholars have been roughly aligning them. They've been able to do that with the fall of these capitals. How accurate this is to the exact year, we don't know. No. But it is in the same sort of range.
Isn't that a crazy idea, though? So it's like some people don't believe in the Sea Peoples at all. They think, like, sure, there was some battles here and there, but it's all blown out of proportion. And all of these, like you just said, they're all located on these fault lines. Yeah. They all just were because of natural disasters. Yes. That's why people fled.
Very true. And people use the argument of what is called a earthquake storm. And this can actually result in what you can call an unzipping of a fault line. So this occurs over a period of years, could even be decades, where different sections of the fault line slip and result in not miniature, because they could be quite destructive, but just like different areas of seismic activity and earthquakes again. So this could have almost been seen as like a domino effect, and like you could almost say this is from the gods, right? Like this is some sort of divine sort of power that's like,
well, yeah, like you described that in a very light way, but really, like, earthquake storm, the unzipping of a fault line, this is a series of earthquakes that never stop over potentially decades,
or they could stop and then they start up again. People could interpret that as the gods are angry with them. Maybe that's why they moved away from coastlines. I don't know.
But again, why would you move to a more precarious location for earthquakes, right? And the American archaeologists that accompanied Nowitzki too made the point in that documentary that people recover from earthquakes really quick, even multiple ones, reoccurring ones. They recover very, very quickly throughout history. So, would they have gone right back down to the water? It sort of seems like they would have if that was the reason.
Maybe they thought God was punishing them and that they needed to go to the most extreme places in order to make it stop. I don't know. I'm not a religious person myself, so I'm not sure. You know, some people get a lot of martyrish ideas in their head, and they were like, well, we need to go suffer. Let's go.
I guess that's possible.
I don't know.
Like if you feel like the gods of the sea, like if there's a tsunami or something.
Exactly,
like that,
right? Yeah, because like they're like, oh my goodness, Poseidon or whoever they believed in at that time is angry with us. So.
Right. I feel like that's part of it. Like, how cool of an idea is it to think that like the sea peoples are just a confederation that is really in tune with the earth, and maybe there are these series of earthquakes taking place and they time it perfectly, so earthquake takes place and then sure enough the sea people show up shortly after when a city is weak and decimated and they take what they please.
I like that.
That's kind of interesting. Let's touch on the tribes.
Yeah.
Because we're still trying to figure it out. We will never truly know who the hell these people were.
No.
There's 9 factions that made up these marauders, and the first of which was the Sheridan, described by the Greeks. Is that correct?
The Sheridan? No, these were Egyptian records. So, yeah, like you said, they do mention 9 tribes. There were only 5 that we actually got the names of. But we didn't want to get too bogged down in these specific groups. We just wanted to mention a few things that kind of made them unique in their own way. So it would have represented a specific wave with a specific sort of cultural sort of appearance and style of attack and stuff like that.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess like we said already, like some believe they may have originated in the Western Mediterranean, possibly linked to the Sardinians, but I don't know. The
Sheridan, right?
The Sheridan, yeah, like because of the name, the S, right?
Right.
So, but I don't know, like I don't know how satisfactory that is for me. The weaponry and the dress they wore does have some vague similarities to the tribal factions on Sardinia, apparently. That being the round shields, horned helmets, and the types of swords.
Oh, yeah.
But others disagree with that. There's a quote here from Ramses II describing the Sheridan. The unruly Sheridan, whom no one had ever known how to combat. They came boldly sailing their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them.
Ooh.
That doesn't sound like a tribe from Sardinia.
No.
That sounds like something a little more intense than that.
The unruly Sheridan.
Right? That no one knew how to combat.
Had ever known. Ever.
So does that mean no one ever knew how to fight them, or no one had ever even known of them?
Right.
Therefore, they don't know how to fight them.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
An unknown compelling force.
And just think about that. It's the same sort of idea of like my pre-Columbian contact fascination and sitting there, and all of a sudden you have these ships coming towards you and the people on board, and you have no idea who they are. What they are, who they are, where they're from, what is that ship? It's
and
just
they're not
bizarre.
Peaceful.
And they want to kill you.
Yeah, that's not
That's
very
always
nice.
a nice cherry on top.
I thought this was interesting, though, here, where it says the first certain mention of the Sheridan is found in Ramses II's records. And that the pharaoh had actually incorporated many of these warriors into his personal guard.
The ones that they had captured.
Yeah, that is interesting to me.
Yeah.
And that speaks to some type of cultural uniformity where they were able to be like, so they're not like these
Vikings.
crazy Vikings that can't be tamed, that can't be negotiated with or something. These are people that have some type of reason, because if they're part of the personal guard of the emperor of, you know what I mean? Like,
well, unless that's your only option. You become a mercenary for the emperor, or you're...
Well, true. But to my mind, that kind of speaks to the idea that these could have been previous mercenaries that had gone their own way, maybe become embittered because of economic and financial constraints and whatever, suffering from famine, all these things.
Yeah.
And then they go and do all this badass stuff with taking down the, you know what I mean, like in these waves of attacks, and it's impressive, right? So he's like, okay, well, let's get you back in here, and let's get you well fed and treat you nice, and hopefully be on our team now.
Yeah, no, but you're right though. There must have been some sort of, like, because if you're coming from across the sea, like, or something crazy like that, then how you're not gonna be able to communicate. They're not gonna be able to do anything,
the
right?
language.
Like, you're not gonna understand anything.
The language would have been huge. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, I was just going to move on to the Shekelesh, because these people were quite interesting too. These were my personal favorites when we were looking through the descriptions, because they're quite, again, right, murky origins. No known source of where they came from, but they had massive beards, which is very interesting. And they wore pointed kilts. Some had tassels on them. Others wore large medallions on their chests. I wasn't able to ascertain whether these were bronze medallions, gold, I don't know. Others just had simple leather straps bound across their chests. And their weapon of choice was the scimitar, a style of dagger originating from the east, or they would carry 2 spears with them. So,
double spear. That's hardcore.
Double spear them.
Sweet. Well,
just like in... This just brought to mind. When we were watching...
Deadpool?
Yeah. And he's like,
the double
how
sword.
did this guy just become a human kebab?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Well, that makes me wonder if there's any links to, like, honestly, like, potentially, like, ancient Mongolians and, like, other groups from the northeast, or something along those lines, too. I mean, if there's... Because there's no way... Because that's a weird description, right? Like, medallions on your chests, pointed kilts, massive beards. That's definitely a feature of the Mongolian hordes. But the kilts sounds Celtic, but this is way predating any Celtic tribes in Europe. This is like definitely. 1,000 years before.
For sure.
So that's strange. That doesn't sound Mediterranean. You know what I mean?
No, it doesn't sound Mediterranean, but I am not an expert in the garb of Mediterranean warriors. So.
Well, that's just it. This episode was like, there's so much detail. We just thought the story was really cool. Like, we could have an whole episode just on the weapons and, you know, defense.
And yeah, exactly what they were wearing. There was one example known as the fustanella.
Okay.
And this was actually a traditional pleated skirt-like garment. I don't know if it was actually pointed or not, but it was referred to as a kilt, and it was worn by men, and most widely used in the Balkans area, so Southeast Europe.
Interesting. In the Balkans. So there could be these kingdoms coming from way far north.
Exactly. And I'm not sure how modern this is, but apparently in Greece there is a short version of the fustanella, sorry guys, that's worn in ceremonial military units.
Interesting. Crazy.
Cool, hey?
Very cool.
So kilts don't have to be Celtic.
No. Well, they of course not. But if that's just automatically what 99.999 people are going to think of when you hear that word.
Very true,
right?
And that's why we kind of want to tackle that and just be like, you know what? But yeah, okay. So we have all of these tribes where we don't have any origins for any of these guys. No. It's kind of annoying, but we do have origins for one group of people that are. I'm not even going to say. They have been sort of lumped together as what has been termed Luwian-speaking peoples or tribes.
Right.
And this idea that comes from Luwian Studies, and it's a research group that's headed by one Eberhard Zanger, and he actually claims that the Sea Peoples were a coalition of these Luwian-speaking peoples that joined together against a common enemy, the Hittites. And basically these Luwian speakers were disparate, like just small tribes, kingdoms, uncontrolled by the Hittites. They were on the same peninsula, so like we said, the Anatolia Peninsula there, in the very east. And they were also known to originate from like even like further eastward, so the Asia Minor region too.
Crazy.
Yes. So essentially, they were all different sort of... not uniform culturally, but they did have common language. And so a lot of people will take issue with just the ease at which this guy Zanger refers to them as one people, because that's a very convenient way of referring to them.
Yeah.
But anyways, the Luwians actually preceded the formation of the Hittites. There's evidence of hieroglyphic texts from these people as early as 2000 BCE.
Crazy.
Yeah, and this is a quote here. It says, since most Luwian hieroglyphic documents have thus far been found in early Iron Age Syria and Palestine, the term Luwian is often used to denote people at the eastern end of the Mediterranean during the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, so way after the incursions of the Sea Peoples, so they were around after, which some people use that as evidence to say that they were the Sea Peoples.
That they made it through.
Or they made it through, or they were the Sea Peoples.
Right.
But then, however, this is another... Just continuing on with the same quote here, it also comprises the people who lived in the Western Asia Minor during the 2nd millennium BCE. So, and they wouldn't have regarded themselves as belonging to neither one, the Hittites or the Mycenaeans. They were just in between.
Interesting.
So that's interesting, right?
Very
so you were
much
mentioning like these little island pockets and kingdoms and whatever else. These people were on the mainland. They had access to a huge amount of very valuable resources of this time. So lots of metals and things like that were used in smeltering for the production of bronze.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's interesting because while many nations lost writing, one of the pillars of civilization during this collapse of the Bronze Age, the Luwians maintained their written language for nearly half a millennium after.
Wow.
And
That's
died
impressive.
out. They died out, like somewhere, like in the rise of the Romans and the rise of the Persians, all that kind of stuff. So
crazy.
But yeah, it's interesting. This Zanger guy, his name is Zangger. He thinks that about 100 years ago, 3,200 years ago, these Luwians amassed a massive war force and destroyed the Hittites. And then basically, this is a quote here. It says, they basically continued their campaign for wealth and power and just headed towards the Mycenaeans, headed towards Egypt. They were like, screw all you guys.
They got some momentum and they kept
exactly.
going.
They were like, if we can take out the Hittites, then we can take out all these people, maybe. So that's kind of his idea there.
I like that idea.
It's interesting to say the least, because it is these sort of different groups, right?
Yeah.
Of roughly from the same region. So they might have been able to, like you said, like have those lines of connectivity of sort of like diplomacy and planning and all the stuff of these attacks. But yeah, these people weren't nobodies. They went on to form a powerful empire of their own post Sea People's invasion and post Bronze Age collapse. It stretched from northern Greece to Lebanon and continued on until they were destroyed by Mycenaean king coalition at the culmination of the Trojan War in Troy.
Crazy. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is actually referred to by Zanger as World War Zero because of its sheer intensity. And because of the fact that these were like almost like it's like a mini globalized sort of political arena in which all this was playing out. But yeah, the Trojan War did bring about the Sea People. So it was quite a bit before Rome. Sorry, I kind of had that wrong there.
That's okay.
So interesting though. Apparently it has been confirmed through satellite imagery the Anatolia Peninsula was heavily populated with these Luwian speakers, and there are over 340 settlements left unexcavated that did not belong to the Hittite Empire that could have potentially been these smaller kingdoms of these people.
Right.
Yes. So, like I alluded to, a lot of archaeologists do consider Zanger's approach to this area of research bombastic to a certain extent, but at the same time, they are kind of grateful to him too, because he's bringing the headlines and he's bringing the public attention and consciousness to these issues, which is no doubt a positive thing for continued research in the area.
Definitely.
But yeah, the idea of an international world war and the idea of cultural uniformity with these Luwian civilizations is highly questionable to a lot of scholars. But again, right, this could be evidence of like all these different waves of different peoples.
Yes.
That could make sense.
I'm leaning that way. I like this guy's take on it for sure.
I like it a lot too.
It's sort of the same kind of an idea with the Etruscans and the idea that they ended up rising up as this, pre-Roman civilization out of Tuscany on the mainland of Italy, of modern-day Italy, and that they were members of the Sea Peoples that survived their own incursions of these places and then didn't necessarily settle, but stayed in the area and ended up settling the areas of Tuscany and became the Etruscans, who have the, I can't remember which it is, they have the indecipherable linear B language. Is that correct? Something along those lines?
So it was inherited from the Minoans. There was that really simplistic, rudimentary language. Then it went to linear A. Then it went to linear B. Parts of linear B have been deciphered, not all of it. And then parts of linear A hasn't been deciphered at all.
Right, okay.
As far as I'm aware.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. So there's no, again, this is kind of a fringy idea though, right? Because there's a lot of historians will just kind of point to the fact that the Etruscans basically rose up they flourished in the 6th century. So this is way after the Bronze Age collapse.
They were around in the 8th century though.
They were around. Mm-hmm. The question is, did they develop out of... They definitely would have developed out of the power vacuum.
Yeah.
Whether or not the actual people themselves were linked to those coming from other places and became the Etruscans, we don't know.
It's loose. Yeah.
We don't know if they're remnants of the Minoan Empire or if they're a shit mix of people, basically. We don't really know. But they were really advanced, and we know that they kept records of basically nothing except for their e-commerce, which is fascinating.
True, yeah.
And
e-commerce?
Commerce, sorry.
No internet.
These guys were just setting up Shopify stores all over the place. Man, I am so used to dealing with our stuff. I'm just like... Yeah, no, but I don't think that theory has any weight, to be honest.
The Etruscans? I like the idea that, like you said, they came out of the power vacuum, that they rose up. Potentially their long-lost descendants could have been remnants of people attacked by sea peoples or the sea peoples themselves. That's where it gets muddy.
Yeah. The one cool thing about them, though, I should point out, we wrote down here, the idea that they were very much like the Minoans and not like the Mycenaeans and other cultures. They were more progressive.
Yeah,
so women
socially
progressive. And that was one of the reasons why the Minoans were potentially the peoples of Atlantis,
right?
Believed to be advanced in social advances and technological advances,
very egalitarian.
Yeah.
One other point I wanted to make on the note of the Etruscans, though, was that they were lords of the seas until they disappeared in history. They had massive trade routes. They were known for their wine in particular, huge exports of all these amphoras. There was one shipment that was found by a recent archaeological excavation in the area that it basically pointed to exactly that. They were the heavyweights as far as the wine goes and all that kind of stuff.
Very cool, right?
Very, very cool. Yeah, and one other point I wanted to make was they actually were quite influential politically. They actually did have several emperors rule in Rome until their influence sort of waned. There was a bit of sort of classic corruption, I would say, excesses, that type of thing, and their influence just waned, and then eventually they were just kind of
just like all
shoved
civilizations,
aside.
Right?
Shoved aside there, yeah. Oh, and another interesting point is that you kind of said that we don't really know where they came from. There has been quite extensive DNA testing on populations of people that are descendants of these Etruscans, and it does point to the idea that they originated out of Tuscany. They did not come from Turkey, as was hypothesized in antiquity and up until modern times. Crazy. Which is cool, right?
So they're local.
They were local, yeah. Because this was my thought, was wait a second. There was this idea that the Etruscans had emigrated from Lydia, which is the eastern coast of present-day Turkey. And that, to me, would have pointed again to a connection to the Luwian-speaking peoples, perhaps, of earlier times. But with this DNA evidence, that kind of throws it out the window. Yeah.
Lots to work with there.
Lots.
The last sort of potential culprit, I mean, I guess we have a few others, but I feel like this is one of the most likely, is the ancient Philistines. So the classic biblical enemies of Israel. They were thought to have come to power at the end of the ways of the Sea Peoples, very much like the Etruscans sort of hundreds of years later. But did they exist before, conquer the area, create a power vacuum, and that's why they rose up in the eras following the Sea Peoples? The Philistines would end up taking over essentially areas of Syria and modern-day Turkey. But there's evidence now that they existed long before the Sea Peoples arrived, leaving people to wonder if they were to blame, if the Philistines are the centralized power organizing these incursions of the Sea Peoples.
I'm curious what their relations would have been with the Hittites.
Well, this would have been the tail end of the Hittite Empire. Okay. So this is when Hittites are gone at this almost. Okay. They're on the down and out at this point. That's why the city of Ugarit was so multicultural.
Oh yeah.
The Hittites were losing control, and it was just a hustle bustle city. But it was a melting pot. Yeah.
It's like Canada.
Yeah, exactly right. It is possible that the Philistines were. I'm just going to read. This is a quote from a writer from Ancient Origins. Reads as follows: It's possible that the Philistines were present when many of the great civilizations collapsed, and somehow they were exempt from a similar fate, which is bizarre. Large amounts of pottery and items that are identified as Philistine have been unearthed at Tel Tayanat, a site located near the border of Turkey and Syria. So these artifacts basically are found near the ruins of an ancient city that archaeologists believe to be the real hometown, the first centralized location of the Philistine Empire. And they believe that this was the capital, and that this was the starting point of them expanding out.
Interesting. So Syria and Turkey, that border.
We do know that they definitely would have tried to expand out and do some things, because there's an inscription of them captured Philistine warriors on the wall at the Medinet Habu.
Oh, yes. So
holding Ramses III.
Ramses III, right. Okay.
So we know that maybe they didn't have it wasn't a successful incursion that time, because there were captured Philistine slaves that were former warriors depicted on the wall.
Interesting. Well,
Does that mean they were...
Can't win them all.
Can't win them all. I think that's honestly my favorite theory. I think it's the most likely.
The Philistines, you think are the most likely.
Actually, sorry, I shouldn't call it my favorite. I think it's the most
plausible?
likely, most plausible.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. I didn't hear you going off that much this week about the Philistines.
Yeah, it kind of came around.
But, okay, so if we're getting to favorites here or whatever, I think one of my favorite ideas, which I already introduced earlier in the episode, is the idea that internal political issues and overextension of empires and resources and all this stuff could have resulted in, these incursions. Like we mentioned, there was this era of great peace, which would have displaced a lot of traditional mercenaries, and that is an economy within itself, right? War is an economy.
Definitely.
Just talk to the people over at, what's that crazy... All right, I'm not even getting into it, because that's international relations. No, not getting into that. But anyways, so my favorite idea is that internal political issues, overextension, we've got issues of famine, drought, all this kind of stuff. I feel like that could have played into desperation on the part of the most vulnerable sectors of society. And I'm talking about the poorest sectors of society.
Yep.
That these foot soldiers and mercenaries, these badass runners of the ancient realm, that this is who those people were.
That was their only job.
Exactly. So once you're out of work, it's just like all the oil workers in Alberta. It's like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to make shit happen. Yeah. You're going to stir up some stuff and try and correct what you think might have been wronged. So that explains a huge motivation to go after these massive empires, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So, interestingly, yes, the beginning of these sieges coincides with a time of peace. I think that's just my favorite idea, that these penniless, poor warriors could have banded together to form a powerful coalition of their own. Because all these people came from all corners of the Mediterranean, and they were essentially that. They were just paid fighters. Didn't matter. You didn't have to be an Egyptian to be part of the Egyptian war force. You just had to be, good enough to kill a few people.
You had to have a couple of legs and a couple of arms, and that's about it, pretty much.
Legs, and you're in.
I guess I have to say sorry, continue. Finish your thought.
Yeah. There was... so that is kind of an oversimplification of that theory that I just put forth, but just for, entertainment's sake, whatever, we're going to leave it at that. But there were other issues going on, economic issues. There was this line of thought that reasons that, like I said, overextension of economic and political resources resulted in this collapse, which made desperate merchants and soldiers turn to a coalition of sorts. These could have been Mycenaean Greek, like the Achaean populations. I have this interesting quote here. Basically says, quote, "The Achaean kings of smaller tribal groups were facing financial problems as their factories were producing about half the products compared to the production of the 14th century. They lacked skilled craftsmen and slaves, and their territories have been plagued by overcrowding." Added to this was the sea routes that they were using for trade were becoming more and more insecure. There was increasing piracy and raids, and their savings had, quote-unquote, been evaporated. So maybe these people were like, you know what? This is going south. We should probably band together. We have a little bit of political organization, and let's just try and do this. So that's ballsy. Another idea there. Mm-hmm.
Definitely ballsy, that's for sure.
That's plausible, right? In my opinion.
That's the opinion of a lot of historians too, obviously, right?
True. Well, that's where we're getting this from, right?
Yeah,
I didn't make this up.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense. Mm-hmm. I think honestly, it's I feel like it's a little bit of all of this stuff, which is kind of, I don't want to take away from the story because I want it to be a massive pirate confederacy, and that's part of it. but I feel like it's just, like you said, a domino effect, a bunch of different things. Possibly these multiple incursions aren't even organized. Maybe only like 3 of them are organized together, and then the ones that come later have nothing to do with the first sets of incursions. It just seems to be that way, and we don't have the record of it. Possibly, but
very possible.
For the most part, it seems like it's really organized. And this is my favorite theory, okay? I take back what I said before.
All right.
I do believe that there's a chance that there were Northern Europeans that were responsible for the first waves against the Mycenaeans and more northernly groups of the Aegean, essentially.
Okay.
So whether or not these were Vikings or early Vikings, essentially, like Norse, or coming from the Rus, coming from ancient Russia and Siberia and Mongolia and those types of areas, I don't know, like the Black Sea.
Or even just
Central
Germanic
Europe.
tribes.
Totally.
The Baltic coastline. One thing that does correspond with this idea is that there were trade routes, and there was the Danube, the Rhine, that were basically water highways.
Yes.
And that there was such thing as the Amber Route, which was a trade route coming from the Baltic coastline where amber was sourced, the semi-precious stone.
Yes.
And then shipped down the line.
Yeah, so it's definitely... and we know for sure, too, that during this time, at the end of the Bronze Age, there was trade all the way up and around the coast through to what is now the modern day UK and Ireland.
True. Yeah, like along the coastline there. Mm-hmm.
So people were connected this far. The question is what would have caused people up that far north to come down and try to attack and without settling and things like that? Like, this wasn't a force like the Nazis or something where it's like, we're coming in and we're going to occupy. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, that's what...
Take over,
that's
like the
what
motherland.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's what most wars and things are more or less for, right? You want to take a city, you want to take a territory, or you want to take stuff from them, none of which really happens here. It's kind of like, attack, eat some food, leave, come, show up again 10 years later.
Yeah, totally. Do it all again. It's like a big party, right?
So that sounds very Viking.
It kind of does sound very Viking. And I actually came across, because I did want to explore this tangent a little further, and the idea that this could have been northern explorers, perhaps, that needed supplies, needed stuff, right? So they have to pillage as they go.
Right.
And certainly the Bronze Age in the north of continental Europe produced many amazing artifacts, and even further, right, into the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and all that kind of stuff. There were many things uncovered. One in particular was very bizarre. At first, it was the only one of its kind ever recovered. This was in Sweden, and it does not fit with local manufacture patterns, causing many to believe it came from somewhere else, somewhere down south.
Strange.
Perhaps.
Okay.
And this was called the Balcakra ritual object, or more simply, the gong ritual object.
Crazy.
Which has no known purpose in that culture at that time. And it was actually found in a bog in Sweden, like I said, in this sort of rural area.
Ominous.
Yeah, very weird. So, description of this artifact, this is a quote. The item consists of a round frame made of bronze, perforated with holes, and carried by 10 wheels. A flat and loose bronze plate was placed on top of it. The plate is decorated with zigzag patterns. The diameter of the plate is 42 centimeters or 17 inches and is slightly concave. Interestingly, this is a continuation of the quote, an identical bronze object was found in northern Hungary near Sopron in 1913. These pieces are the only 2 of their kind in the world. Technique shows that they were manufactured in the same workshop, perhaps by the same craftsman.
Wow.
And it's quite intricate. Some people actually say that this was the first example of serial production in a European workshop because on each module there are actually lines and dots. It's kind of like a number system. And they show the place of the module in the structure, which I'm not even sure what that means. That's a quote. But essentially, it was like, it almost reminds me of the Antikythera, where you get these etchings, these little ancient markers of technology. And so these were dated to be around the right time. So somewhere in between 1500 to 1000 BCE, which supports the idea that trade routes were coming from the southeast of Europe going up, and then again, right, it was a mutual thing.
There were potentially trade routes all the way through to China, all the way up through right? Because if there was links between the Mediterranean and the Far East and between the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, then there would have been links between all.
And that was my first thought. As soon as I heard the word gong, I was like, this has to come from Asia.
It sounds very Chinese, doesn't it?
It does, because they think it might have been like a ritual drum for religious practices or something like that. I don't even know. It did bring to mind again the ritual as like some sort of ancient magic or ancient ritual practice, which
some sort of an occult object,
which researchers have been unable to place in their, in the knowledge that they already have. So it's just this weird sort of anachronistic type thing.
So is it from trade? Is it a piece of a strange spoil of war brought back from incursions made by Norse fighters residing in modern day Sweden?
It's a lot of conjecture, a lot of whatever, but I loved that little bit there.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's really neat too.
Yeah.
You added this little bit in here too because
the Celts and the Druids. Yeah,
but of course this is like 1,000 years out of the ancient Celts and Druids. There would have been tribes, Germanic tribes.
It was actually dominated by the cumulus culture of that time, and that was between 1600 to 1200 BCE. And basically, this tumulus culture was a warrior society with a lot of chiefdoms, a lot of small kingdoms. And it was all over Central Eastern Europe, and they had a lot of fortified structures. They were also the first to kind of bury their dead, I think, in like some sort of ritual.
Like in a specific ritual way.
It was fun though. When I was looking into these people, I actually came across this really cool this website all about druids, and there was this one quote. This is totally irrelevant to the episode, but I just loved this. So this is 26,000 years ago in pre-druid ancient times. This is a quote. It says here, "The evidence of religious activities of prehistoric inhabitants of Western Europe is remarkable. On the Gonwar Peninsula near Swansea in Wales, the Paviland Caves have revealed one of the earliest magico-religious sites in the world, where around 26,000 years ago, a group of humans carefully interred a skeleton, wrapping the body in red cloth and rubbing it with red ochre, and laying it with mammoth ivory rods, which may be the earliest magic wands ever found." I was like, what?
Oh, man.
No
That's
way.
really cool.
I love that. I was like, cool.
Early Harry Potter.
We're not really getting into magic this episode and druids, but I just I had to throw that in there. I was like, you can't not mention that.
No, totally. That's fascinating.
Isn't
There's
there?
a whole episode waiting right there, I think, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Last but not least, we're going to finish off the episode here with the craziest of all the theories that really has absolutely no basis in reality whatsoever, but it's really fun, and people do believe it. And that is that the incursions of the Sea Peoples were brought on by remnants of the population of Atlantis.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this theory is that the Minoans, the ancient Minoans, were the earliest writing in Europe and predated the Mycenaean Greeks, were thought to be the descendants of the Atlanteans as well. That they were the surviving remnants of that ancient population that were, sunk into the sea, right? As Plato famously writes, 9,000 years before Plato, or whatever it was, date-wise. But it's interesting, though, because it kind of... If you believe there to be a population of mysterious people similar to the Atlanteans in a way, it makes sense that if they were if they were decimated in some way, that whatever remaining population of them would band with tribal factions that are also experiencing similar plights in an attempt to maybe, even though they weren't necessarily like a warring nation in the stories of Plato, take back some of their former glory from the thousands of years prior where they controlled the Mediterranean.
Okay.
And sack these false empires that now exist today. From a narrative perspective, it's fun, but it makes a little bit of sense.
A little bit.
If you were a fallen empire and all you see in now left, a shadow cast over you is just the Egyptians and the Hittites and these basically smaller, more minuscule empires comparatively that are always fighting each other and not really ever getting anywhere and not expanding to the wealth and up into the stratosphere.
Could you
of
imagine?
Atlanteans.
Well, yeah, just imagine someone some sort of emissary or ambassador of the Atlanteans coming to your chiefdom or your kingdom of an island and basically telling you this amazing story and the amazing things that you can do if you band with these legendary people. That to me would be quite appealing.
Restore them to their former glory.
Exactly, yeah.
And be a part of it.
A sort of romanticized sort of vision.
Yeah. So of course, some people do believe this that the Minoans or maybe factions of the Minoans were left from the Atlanteans, and they're the ones who organized all of this. I kind of like that too.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It's far out there, but
I think the craziest of all, though, is that the Sea Peoples were originated from North America.
Yeah. That takes the cake for
absolutely
sure.
There's no way. There's just no way. Not that they couldn't have made it there, because I'm the transoceanic contact guy.
Oh yeah.
Definitely, there could have been peoples from the Pacific or from North America that could have made it to Europe, mainland Europe.
Yeah.
But would they have come with hundreds of soldiers and been able to fight and be incorporated into armies after the fact?
No.
Doesn't make any sense.
No, it really doesn't.
As cool
Actually,
as it
I
is.
really like that idea of this is a totally fictionalized narrative, but the idea of the reversal, right, of the traditional colonial narrative where the Spanish and the Portuguese show up on the shores of North America. What if it was North American natives that had actually traversed the Atlantic and waged war on these people and actually decimated them? They're like, boom! All right, mic drop, we're going home.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Very curious. That kind of wraps it up.
It
sort
does.
of brings us down to the end here of the Sea Peoples, this mysterious ancient story. I don't know.
Ancient badasses.
Pretty much. If you were to kind of have any concluding thoughts at all, I mean, do you have anything you want to finish off with?
I would like to say that I immensely enjoyed the research on this one. Like we said, there's a million rabbit holes, there's a million different names, places, peoples. I hope we didn't get too bogged down and it was entertaining for all of you guys at home and that you learned something, because I learned so much this week, and ancient history is just
so cool. The ancient
so
Near
good.
East is just very, very cool.
Even if this is just a completely mythological story of sea peoples that has been aggrandized over the years, I love it.
Totally.
Love it. And I do stick to my guns with the idea that I think it could have been almost like a proletarian type revolution where all these it's hard done by people that were tossed aside in times of hardship because they're no longer necessary are just pissed, and they're like, you know what?
Which is just so
Screw
cool.
you all. We're taking over.
Yeah. And taking over the largest empires in the world.
And that does to me, again, justify the idea that, they just came in, wrecked everything, and then basically left. And they were like, yep, that's all we wanted to do. We wanted to tear you down.
Yep. And we have, we went through, we were ushered into the Dark Ages, and as the Dark Ages started to fade away, and the Iron Age was soon to take off, we see people moving back down to the coasts, away from these weird, precarious locations. We have a resurgence in philosophy, in thinking, and in writing, and this is where you see basically the rise of the most famous era in all of Greek history, with the most famous philosophers that come out of it. And they usher in basically the era that invented democracy. More or less, I want to finish off by saying that whatever happened in this ancient story, if it was just sea peoples or a combination of them and earthquakes and different things, what happened at the end of the Bronze Age changed the world. And it's the reason we exist today the way we do. And it's the reason we have democracy. It's the reason that we have the engineering feats that were achieved in the Iron Age. Those might never have been possible if these power vacuums weren't created, and those empires of the Egyptians and so on just limped and just clung to their survival for another few thousand years. Yeah, exactly. Without these advancements being made. Yeah. Because the power vacuum wouldn't have been there.
We could be a full 1,000 years behind right now.
Yes, because if it weren't for these incursions.
Yeah.
And very little people have ever heard about it. So we really wanted to bring this story to you guys.
So everyone, be thankful for the Sea Peoples.
Yes, be thankful for the Sea Peoples, even though they were brutal seafaring pirates that slaughtered people.
They made change happen.
They made it happen. So, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Oh, wait, do we have a film? We gotta announce the film we're gonna do. It's Sunday.
Uh-oh.
We might have to do that on social media or something.
We will.
That's okay. We'll announce it later tonight. And thank you guys so much for listening to this ancient history episode. Let us know your thoughts on what you think is the explanation for all of this. Who were the Sea Peoples? What is your favorite theory? Reach out to us, as usual, on the best places on our Facebook forum. Absolutely love it. So search Into the Portal Podcast on Facebook, click the group, join us on there. Really want to hear what you guys think. Or you can shoot us an email, intotheportalmailbox@gmail.com.
Yes.
Come hit us up on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram, at Into the Portal Podcast. Give us some more followers. We want to show you guys some cool stuff that we find.
Yep.
And we'll be back next week.
Yes, we will.
This was a podcast from the Podfix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.